Hello and welcome back on this nice sunny day here in my office. So today we're going to start with our first lecture over chapter 22 covering plants. We're actually going to be in plants for a couple weeks. So we're going to do chapter 22, which is the diversity of plants, kind of introducing what plants are and talk about the different groups and classifications of plants, go through a couple life cycles. Chapter 44, so we're jumping way ahead in the book, is going to be covering more of the anatomy and physiology of plants, kind of their structure and function. And then chapters, make sure I get my number right, chapter 45 is going to be covering plant reproduction. So we actually have 3 chapters we're going to be covering in these next 2 weeks that are going to be focusing on plants. So let's go ahead and get started. So for this chapter, the overview, we're going to talk about what makes a plant, so what their key features are, a little bit of background of how they evolved from primitive organisms. The major groups will go through the classifications and, like I said, see some of those life cycles and the differences as they kind of go from water, being near water plants as they've evolved to terrestrial plants, and then lastly how plants affect other organisms, primarily us. So what is a plant? So plants, if you remember, are one of our big kingdoms. We're still in the domain of eukarya. So their cells have a nucleus, membrane-bound organelles. So what makes plants different from some of the other organisms we looked at, like animals? You saw a lot of animals back in by 102 if you took that class. We saw protista in this class. So protists were single-celled or multicellular, plant-like or animal-like. They were more of the junk drawer. Then last week we took a look at fungi, and so some of its characteristics were multicellular or single-cellular, heterotrophic, so they took in their nutrients, and with a chitin cell wall, and they had lots of different reproductive properties. So a plant is different than all of those other types of organisms. It gets its own kingdom because, one, it can photosynthesize. That's one of its big kind of characteristics. It has the ability to produce its own food. We use the word autotroph for that, so kind of self-feeding. All plants are multicellular, so there's no single-celled plant in existence with dependent embryos. And they go through their reproductive cycles very much what we call alternation of generations. So you're going to see very clear, distinct life stages with both the diploid and the haploid generation. So we can see this generic alteration of generations here in this guide. And what we're going to see a little bit later is just adding some details to make the sporophyte look plant-like, to make the gametophyte look plant-like. But in general, your diploid sporophyte, spores, because it's kind of like the gametes, if you will, have fused together to make a diploid sporophyte, goes through meiosis to make your haploid gametes. Those gametes are going to grow. Sometimes they grow into a plant-like haploid organism. They go through mitosis to make their haploid gametes, and those fertilize and you're back to the diploid generation. So this pattern is what we call alternation of generations, and that is a key feature of plants. So taking a look at the biological history of plants, the origin of plants comes from water plants. So plants that live in watery environments. So here's a nice example of one that we can see completely submerged underwater, a couple different species actually. And here's a close-up of one with their little reproductive cells in the orange orbs there. So life in water was advantageous because you could get your gases, you could get rid of your oxygen, you get your carbon dioxide. Water, if it's clear enough, you had enough sunlight to come through to carry out your photosynthesis. And the biggie is reproduction. So you could just release your gametes into the watery environment and they could find each other out there in that watery environment. Early plants started to colonize the land. They kind of moved away from water a little bit. And to do that, they had to really become unique in how they do the reproductive processes. So we'll see that a little bit later. They have advantages of being able to grow larger. They get vascular tissue, but they also have some disadvantages, or challenges, I should say, how they had to overcome those challenges to be successful away from water. So some of those adaptations that allowed plants to become successful on land, which we know they are because they're everywhere on terrestrial environments and not so much in watery environments anymore, is they had to get water. So water is a requirement for photosynthesis. So if you are in the water, no challenge there. If you're on land, how do you get access to water? So this was the development of roots or root-like structures, lots of surface area as these structures kind of weave their way through the soil looking for water. And if you are in the terrestrial environment, if it's air, you could lose that water. So you're doing all that work with your roots to pull up the water, but then it could just be lost right out through your leaves. So to protect that, plant leaves and stems usually have what's called a cuticle. Just like we have a cuticle layer on our hair and our skin and our fingernails, cuticle layers are kind of thick, lipidy, waxy coverings over the leaves to prevent water from just diffusing or osmosing out of the cell, or sorry, out of the leaf. But then there's a challenge with that. If you're gonna like waterproof all of your leaves, that's great. You're not gonna lose water, but you still have to do photosynthesis, which means you still have to take in carbon dioxide and you have to get rid of your waste product of oxygen. So if you sealed all of your leaves with this nice waxy cuticle to prevent water loss, you've also sealed off all of your gas exchange. So another adaptation that land plants have to do is they've popped these little holes in the bottom sides of their leaves, and these are called stoma or stomata. So this is a gas exchange structure, and again, we're going to see this a lot later. We're just kind of doing the overview today. So that helps you regulate get your water and not lose your water, but still also be able to do gas exchange. Some other adaptations that we will again talk about later, like I've been alluding to, is this what's called xylem and phloem. These are the conducting tissues. That's what's found in roots and stems and branches. Xylem is what carries water up from the root system out to the rest of the plant, and phloem is kind of the downward movement of any sugars or photosynthetic products that are moving down into different regions of the plant and then typically stored in the roots. And then lastly, lignin is a strong protein that helps to keep the plants upright so they don't flop over, along with the cellulose in their cell walls. And so it allows plants to grow really tall and reach up towards that sunlight and potentially outcompete any other organisms in their environment to try to get that sunlight for their photosynthesis. Some reproductive adaptations that you have to see when plants move from water to land is seeds. So a seed, which we can take for granted, is an adaptation for plants moving onto land. So our reproductive gametes, so the pollen, we can see a whole bunch of pollen here with this cone plant releasing its pollen, and then a nice close-up of one of our pollinators. I wore my bee shirt today. Be happy, because I knew we were talking about pollination to some degree. And so these are going to be the pollens from a flower. So some plants release their pollen to let wind disperse them. Some plants release their pollen with pollinators, like bees and moths and butterflies and things like that. So these gametes have to be transported in a different way, because they're on land now. They can't utilize water as much. Some still do, but most of our land plants need another way to distribute and disperse their gametes. So your seed plants, your flowering plants have all these adaptations to help with this reproductive stage of making more of themselves. And they're really successful at doing that. Just look outside and you see a ton of plants that are successfully growing in our terrestrial environments. So now we're going to get into the different groups of plants. So just like you saw with protists and back in 102, looking at the different groups of animals, if you remember vertebrates and invertebrates and all the different kinds of groups there, we kind of have the same idea, this classification. So the two major groups are what we call non-vascular plants, and then the other group are vascular plants. And the word vascular in this context is that xylem and phloem. So organisms that are in the non-vascular plant category, they don't have xylem and phloem, but they still have those other characteristics. They're multicellular, they're photosynthetic, and they have this alternation of generation. So they check the boxes for being a plant, but they're not fully terrestrial, and they still have to be close to water because they don't have the vascular system to withstand being too far away from water. The other group, the vascular plants, they have these developed transportation tissues. My brain got stuck. The xylem and phloem. So all of these examples of plants do have that vascularized tissue, and then we'll have a sub breakdown of those where we have ones that do not have seeds. So mosses and ferns, club mosses I should say, and ferns and horsetails, they reproduce via spores. And then our two major groups of seed plants are gymnosperms and angiosperms. These are kind of what most people are familiar with when they are talking or thinking about plants. So taking a look at our non-vascular plants, again, as their name implies, they don't have vascular tissue, so no xylem, no phloem. They usually have to be close by water for their reproduction, for their acquisition of water, for their photosynthesis. They rely mostly on diffusion, which means they have to be pretty small. So less than 1 inch tall, right? So 1 inch is not that much. So you're not going to be seeing huge liverworts or hornworts or mosses growing up like a tree size. They're tiny. So if you want to get a good look at some of these non-vascular plants, go crawling around on the forest floor or next to a stream or a riverbed or a lake. You're looking for environments that are moist, they have access to water, and your plants are going to be really small. You might have some mosses growing on your sidewalk at home. I know I do. And if I wanted to get down on my hands and knees and look at them, they'd probably look just like that. This one here on the bottom. So one of the life cycles we're going to go through is a representative life cycle of a typical moss. So again, we can see our alternation of generations. The yellow is representing our diploid and our blue is representing our haploid. So we're going to start with step 1. So these are our haploid gametophytes. So the reason why they're called gametophyte is basically sex plant. Gamete is like a sex cell plant. So the gametes are your egg and sperm. And we should know from previous life cycles, egg and sperm are haploid. So they have already gone through meiosis. And in this case, they grow up into a plant-like structure. So that little moss fluff that you see, that is a haploid plant. So in their different structures, we have antheridium for the male and archegonium for female sex cells. They go through mitosis to make their gametes. So the gametophyte plant makes the gametes via mitosis because they're already haploid, they can just duplicate. Then you have your male sperm through water, so they have to have water in their environment, kind of swim down into the archegonium, find the egg, fertilize the egg. So now we are in our diploid stage. So that's the yellow part of this life cycle. So now we have a diploid organism, which is now called the sporophyte, and it grows up into this stalk that kind of sticks out of the gametophyte. Again, you can look at any moss that you might find, and if it's in its reproductive cycle, you might see the little fluffy gametophyte with this long stalk of the sporophyte growing up. So within these capsules, you have your stem cells. They will go through meiosis, right? So we go to diploid, back to haploid, releasing the spores. The spores land, they grow back up into your gametophyte, and the cycle continues. So here's your alternation of generations where most of the plant is in the gametophyte stage and just a small little reproductive part is in the sporophyte stage. All right, so that was our non-vascular plants. So then we're going to take a look at our vascular plants. Again, we've talked about their xylem and phloem. The xylem helps bring water up from the roots out to all the structures. The phloem helps to return any photosynthetic product, typically sugars. We're just going to call them sugars. Distributes them to different parts of the plant as well as down into the roots for storage. Sometimes you eat those big storage roots, like a tuber, like a potato or a carrot, those types of things. Thanks, photosynthesis. Excuse me, in vascular plants, their sporophyte stage is usually larger and more conspicuous. And then of the vascular plants, we have two major groups like we talked about before: seedless, which reproduce with spores, and seeded, which are going to be your kind of conifers and your flowering plants. So our seedless vascular plants, we've got a couple of examples here: club mosses, horsetails, ferns, and tree ferns. They are still connected to water. So they're vascular, so that means they can get a little bit bigger. They can get a little bit further away from water, but they still rely on water for reproduction. So their gametes, the male gametes, the sperm, have flagella, so they can swim through the water to reach the female structure. They don't produce seeds, so they have spores, sorry. I accidentally hit the button when I was coughing and now I can't go back. So those were our characteristics of seedless vascular plants. And then on to this next slide, showing you a little bit more detail of those different examples. So club mosses, misnomer, they're not true mosses. That's just the name a taxonomist gave them, and it kind of stuck. So they're pretty small, but still taller than your non-vascular plants. Horsetails, you might see these growing along Bear Creek Bikeway, the pathway if you ride your bike along that. We can see those growing along Bear Creek. They can be also quite a bit taller, but not usually taller than 3 feet. And ferns, you might be familiar with ferns if you go walking through a forest path. So let's do an example of a life cycle of one of our vascular seedless plants. We're going to use the fern as an example. So again, we have our alternation of generations. We have our blue arrows as representing the haploid stage. The yellow arrow is representing our diploid stage. So we'll find our step 1. So here we have, again, our antheridium is for the male reproductive parts, and the archegonium is for the female. And so these haploid structures will be producing their gametes just by mitosis, because they're already haploid. They're going to make their haploid gametes. The sperm via water will swim through their watery environment and land in the archegonium, fertilizing the egg. Now we are on to our diploid stage. The diploid sporophyte is the fern. So that's growing up here. It makes the typical fronds that you might see, these large leaf-like structures. And on the underneath side, they're producing these little sporangia, which are the houses that the spores live in. They go through meiosis to produce their spores, release the spores. The spores land in a nice environment and grow into this, what's called this, it's called a thallus, but it's this heart-shaped gametophyte. Here's little root-like structures. And on the gametophyte, this is where they're going to produce their archegonium and antheridium for their egg and sperm. So then we come back together and we've completed a cycle. So when you go out in the woods the next time and you look at a fern, the big fronds, that's the sporophyte generation. You could dig a little bit under the dirt to look for that thallus, that kind of heart-shaped gametophyte stage, which is a little bit reduced in size. The fronds, the sporophyte fronds, are the bigger of that stage of this life cycle. Now we're going to get into our vascular seeded plants. So in vascular seeded plants, you're going to have egg and sperm, just like you do with all other examples. In seeded plants, the male reproductive gamete, what we've been calling sperm, is now going to be called pollen. So pollen is the name for the male reproductive cell in seeded plants, usually dispersed by wind or animals. We'll see that a little bit later. Seeds usually have 3 components. We have the embryonic plant. So this is the baby plant. This is the embryo. We can see one here in a pine seed or in a bean seed. Okay, so that's the diploid baby plant. You have food, so that's the seed, that's what we eat. Right? I don't think I have any seeds in my trail mix here. I don't have any seeds. So like if you have a bean or like a peanut, that's going to be the stored food. And then usually have a protective outer coat to kind of keep the seeds, the embryo, and the nutrition source protected from the environment. So both of our seeded vascular plant groups, the gymnosperms and angiosperms, will have these similar characteristics. We're going to dive way deeper into seeds when we get to chapter 45 in plant reproduction. So our 2 groups of vascular seeded plants, we have gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are your kind of cone-bearing plants is kind of what gymnosperm means, your cone-bearing plants. So they are going to have some kind of reproductive cone for their housing their eggs and sperm, their pollen and their eggs. So they kind of came along the scene a little earlier than your angiosperms, the flowering plants. So evolutionarily they're a little bit older. We have 4 major groups of gymnosperms that are living today. There's quite a few extinct species that we can see in the fossil record, but we have what are called ginkgos, cycads, cnidophytes, silent G, cnidophytes, and conifers. The first 2 you're probably not very familiar with. The third one you probably are, especially living here in the Pacific Northwest. So we have ginkgos. There's only one living species, genus and species of ginkgos. They have these fan-shaped leaves. They often are we might have some actually over on Fir Street, over by the bus station. I think it's Front Street or Fir Street. They're usually a decorative tree. I went to Oregon State for my undergrad and graduate degrees, and they had lots of ginkgos all over campus. They're good for urban planting, and they can withstand lots of pollution, so they do really well in cities. And then we have cycads. Cycads are really restricted to tropical climates, really warm climates. Most of them, over half of our species, are classified as threatened or endangered. They take a really long time to grow, and they are coveted for horticulturists and people, doing landscaping. And so a lot of times they get removed from their natural habitat and put into somebody's lawn or garden or some other structure away from their natural habitat. And because they take so long to grow and reproduce, it's hard to replace those specimens that have been taken out from their habitat. Cnidophytes are weird. There's two major groups that we're going to talk about. So this one is called a Welwitschia. It's usually found in a desert African country like Namibia. It's very kind of unique in that it only grows two leaves off that central stalk for its entire life, and they just keep on growing and growing, and the further ones they get away from the stump or the stalk, they kind of turn into this weathery kind of fibery stuff. And so they have a tap root. So because they live in desert environments, this tap root goes straight down like 100 feet down into the ground so they can get access to water, and they just grow these two leaves continuously for their whole life. I wrote some notes to make sure I get all of that. Yes. The other interesting cnidophyte that I don't have a picture here is, you might have heard of ephedra. So it's a little shrub. I lived in Reno for a couple years, and they had ephedra all over. Think of like high desert kind of area. This is where ephedrine comes from. It's a stimulant, and it's what kind of speed was derived from. So it's a natural stimulant, and so the extracts of ephedra have to be regulated. So that's kind of where we like pseudoephedrine, Sudafed, that type of stuff comes from ephedra, which is a type of cnidophyte. And then lastly, conifers. So here's just a close-up of one of our probably pines or a cedar. So conifers adapted to cold, dry conditions. These are going to be like your pines and your firs and your cedar trees that you might have in your yard, or you see up on the Niagara Mountains here around the valley. So here's our life cycle of a conifer. So again, we have our yellow is representing diploid stage, our blue is representing our haploid stage, and what I want you to notice, or hopefully you noticed, is the sporophyte, the diploid stage, is way more dominant, and the reduced gametophyte stage is way shorter in this life cycle, where in those earlier plants it was the opposite. The diploid stage was very short, like in the mosses, you just had that little stalk and went right back to the gametophyte stage. So let's start with number one. So we have male and female plants. So the male cone is going to give rise to its pollen inside the male cone, and the female cone, what we typically think of as a pine cone, is most likely going to be the female cone, and deep inside under those scales you're going to find the egg. Then wind, typically the pollen will be released. If you've ever seen like the springtime in a forest and the wind blows, these huge puffs of like yellowy dust comes off of the tree, that's pollen coming from the male cones, and they will land kind of in the scales of the female cones. The pollen will land, grow little pollen tubes. The nucleus of the pollen kind of meets up with your egg within the female. And so then you are going to have your fertilization event happening down here. So the sperm nucleus will fuse with the egg. That's your diploid stage. And so now we have our diploid embryo growing in the seed, and that's going to grow. It's going to land on some fertile soil. It will grow into your seedling and grow up into your mature sporophyte. So your big tall pine trees are going to be your sporophyte generation, and then they'll make their scales for the females, their little male cones for the males, and then they will go into their meiotic haploid stage here. The female goes through meiosis a little bit later here for the female side, and then we get fertilization, and we're doing it all over again. So this is your conifer, like a typical pine tree. All right, our last group, the prettiest ones, saving the best for last, are angiosperms. So these are flowering plants. They are the predominant plant for more than 100 million years. We have over 230,000 species of angiosperms, thanks in some part to humans doing that selective artificial selection in addition to all the natural selection that's going on out there. The major adaptations for such success in angiosperms are flowers, which attract your pollinators, fruits, which attract your pollinators and help you disperse your seeds, and they have broad leaves to pick up more light for photosynthesis compared to the narrow needles that you might see in your conifers. So just some more characteristics about angiosperms. The flowers are the reproductive structures for both male and female components of your plant. The flowers are there to attract pollinators. They can be in different colors, depending on what the pollinator, what they're hoping to get to pollinate, whether they want the bright colors or muted colors, whether they want scent or rotting smell, depending on who they want to come and transfer the pollen to the egg. The fruit is the fleshy part that grows around the seed. So once we've formed the seed and the embryo inside, the fruit helps to attract organisms to come and take that embryo and the seed and then go and disperse that away from the parent, so they're not competing against their offspring. And then lastly, those broad leaves for collecting more sunlight for photosynthesis, so we can make the sugars needed to make our fruit and to just be successful, since you have all that fuel to maintain life. Now we'll take a look at the life cycle of an angiosperm. So again, we'll notice the diploid stage is a lot more dominant, very similar to the conifer, compared to our haploid stage. So we're going to start with step one. Most flowers have both male and female parts on the same flower, where conifers had male and female cones on the same tree. We can have male and female parts within the same structure. Now there are male flowers and female flowers in some species. We're going to focus on the one that has both sexes in the one flower. And again, we're going to see this a lot more in chapter 45. So we have the female part down here in the middle of what's called the stigma, and down deep at the base, this is where we're going to have our stem cell that's going to form our egg. In the anther, at the very tip, this is where our pollen cells are going to be produced. So here in the pollen producing part of the anther, we're going to go through meiosis, and we're going to make our pollen, and then that's going to get picked up typically by your pollinator, a bee or a butterfly or a bat or whoever your pollinator is. In the ovary, kind of the base of your stigma, you're going to go through meiosis to produce your egg. So now we are at the haploid stage. The pollen comes and lands on the stigma. The pollen tube grows down into the ovary, fertilizes the egg. Right, so this is, all the same steps are happening, just different structures. And now we have our embryo, that's our seed. And then if you are a fruit-bearing plant, you will produce your fruit around your seed. Inside is our little baby embryo, right? We talked about seeds. So protecting that is going to be the fruit. So say you have your animal come, oh, that fruit looks great, I'm going to take it off the tree and then I'm going to go and eat it somewhere else. And either you leave the seeds on the ground somewhere and they're going to germinate, or sometimes plants are made that their fruit has to go through the digestive system of an organism to distribute that and activate those seeds to be ready to germinate into the next generation of plant. So lots of different variation in how the fruit is used to distribute those seeds, typically away from the parent, so they're not competing for the same resources. So some ecological roles of plants. They are our photosynthesizers. They are our producers for the most part. We have a lot of producers in our protists living in the ocean, but on terrestrial environments, your plants are it. They are the ones that are converting the sun's energy into chemical energy. So they make the food that everybody else relies upon. They also help to maintain the atmosphere by being a carbon dioxide sink. They can take CO2 out of the atmosphere. They help buffer storms. They can moderate the climate. They are habitats for lots of other organisms. They help to build soil by their being degraded. Their roots help to maintain soil so it doesn't get washed away. And they just kind of keep moisture in the ecosystem. So if you go see a desert with no trees, it's really hard to keep moisture in that environment. You go to a forest, the air is just going to be a little bit more humid. And then lastly, how plants impact us. So there's some benefits to humans. Specifically, we have fuel like wood you can burn to make a fire and kind of break down that cellulose to release heat that we can then use for cooking or staying warm. We can use wood to build our shelter, right? So we can have wooden structures that we can build to protect us from the environment. They're pretty. They give us pleasure. This is a beautiful rock garden. I am not a green thumb by any means. I try my best. I can't grow indoor plants. My outside plants are kind of surviving, but this is gorgeous. And so it makes you feel good to see flowers. And then lastly, a lot of our medicines and drugs actually come from plants, angiosperms in this case, or gymnosperms. This is an example of what's called a yew plant, Y-E-W, and it produces a drug called Taxol, which has been found to be a really successful anti-cancer drug. So in its first kind of discovery, it was a big deal in helping to treat breast cancer specifically. So we can get fuel, shelter, pleasure from these plants, and also they can help save our lives by producing medicines and drugs. All right, so that's the end of our lecture for what is a plant and the different classifications of plants. We'll have another lecture coming up this week and next week, chapter 44, taking a look at more of the structure and function of plants. And then also next week, we'll jump into chapter 45, which will be focusing on the reproduction of plants. All right, see you next time. Bye.